going to the very beginning, this is the basics of communication. So one of the things I love about communication is that it works, it's part of every aspect of our lives. Like if you think about this morning, you probably got on your phone at some point, you probably messaged somebody, text somebody, got on social media, made a phone call. Like I've been on my phone a lot this morning communicating with people. I mean, that's just task related basic things. But then you also have the idea of like, if you were going to class today and you were walking in the hallway, right? And you're walking down the hallway, especially right now we have like masks, so we have to kind of do everything like this, right, with our eyes. But we're walking down the hallway and you see somebody, they make eye contact with you. You don't know them. So you might do one of two things. You might, one, just kind of wave, nod your head, say like, how you doing? Keep on going. Or you might look down. And what is that communicating? If we look down after we look at somebody, that means I don't really want to talk, right? And we know that. And that's just through body language. We didn't tell them, hey, I don't really want to talk to you. Please don't talk to me. We showed them through our body language, hey, I'm not really open to communication with you right now. And sometimes we don't even think about it, but we're so used to communicating. Our brain is so used to communicating that happens just naturally. We do that a lot. So that's kind of what this chapter is about. It's talking about how do we communicate? Why do we communicate? It's all, like the chapter says, the basics of communication and why it's so important. And then in later chapters, we'll start applying those concepts and building onto that. But right now we're just focusing on the basics. All right, so if you have your book, you can turn to page 2. We're going to start with why we communicate. So why do we communicate on a daily basis? So whenever we do this, basically we have so look at this little triangle right here, right? We have this triangle, and that is like the basic safety, like belonging, self-esteem, self-actualization, all of those things. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Maslow was a researcher who came up with this idea that all of our communication builds off of each other. So there's the basics, like there's the basic physiological needs, right? So that's like food, water. Like if we were we didn't have anything, and we say you were in the desert and you're trying to get to somebody, the first thing that you've been out there for a couple of days, the first thing, if you see somebody, what are you going to say? You're not going to be talking to them about their feelings. You're going to say, hey, I need food and water. Nothing else matters if we don't have our physiological needs met, if that makes sense. So until we have that met, we're not caring about our self-esteem. We don't care about our self-actualization, which we'll get to in a minute. We don't care if we belong with a group. If we need food and water, shelter, all those things, that's all that matters in our brains. All right, so that's the first thing. So then once that's met, then we care about safety. So say if you think about even like animals, right? If they're really hungry, I don't know, like a muskrat, I don't know why I thought of that, but a muskrat in the desert, in the jungle, and I'm like running around trying to get my food before a lion or somebody gets me, right? Or whoever eats me. I'm first going to care about food. If I get hungry enough, I'm going to run out and I'm going to get that food, and I'm going to say, to whatever with my safety, right? But if we're full, if we're good, the next thing that they're going to care about as a muskrat is my safety. It's the same kind of concept. If we know that our basic needs are met, the next thing we care about is our safety. And so if you can see that too in a child, so they love their parents or the person, their caregivers, because that is the person that takes care of them. They give them food. Hopefully they do everything for them. The person that takes care of them, they are going to be drawn to and look to them for their safety needs. They're going to communicate that. So say if you see a little kid and you say to say hi, and they kind of run behind their caregiver, that's communicating, stranger danger. But first they communicated that because were able to communicate that because their basic needs were met. All right, so once we have safety, physiological, we have those two things met, then we can start getting into the higher level thinking things. So like love and belonging. So if you think about yourself back in middle school, right? Back in middle school, I think that's kind of why, I guess even in elementary school, but I feel like really in middle school, we start looking for that sense of belonging. We start wanting to find like our friend groups where we fit in, we want all these things, and we communicate a lot about that. We talk a lot about our identity. Without even realizing it, we create an identity. through the clothes that we wear, the people we hang out with, the activities we do, what we talk about, what we don't talk about. All those things, we create this picture of ourselves to the people we're around, right? And so we communicate. The more that we feel like we belong or that we get along well with someone, the better we're going to communicate, the more we're going to communicate. Like if you can think of a best friend or I don't know, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever, just somebody that you felt like I just completely click with this person and I can talk to them about anything, right? The more you feel like you belong with someone, the more that you feel like someone accepts who you are, the more you're going to communicate and self-disclose information about yourself, right? So then when we have that sense of belonging, that dictates our self-esteem and how we communicate about that and the things that we communicate with other people. But our self-esteem is truly built on our sense of belonging. And so if you think about that, if I feel like I don't belong in a friend group, or if you've ever been in a group that you're not really close to, and you're sitting there and I don't know, it's like a new group of friends and you're trying to get into that, but you don't really feel like you belong yet, you don't really have the self-esteem to really get in there and start just talking. I mean, I can talk to anybody and I still feel that like, whenever I'm in a new group of people trying to figure out how they like to communicate, how they like to talk, what we're going to talk about, all of that has to do with my self-esteem. So then self-esteem then builds onto self-actualization. So self-actualization is kind of like this higher thinking. This is where you are searching for something. This is when you are thinking about, what do I want to do in the future? What are my goals? What do I care about? That's when you start thinking at that level, when you start thinking, what is the career that I want to have one day? And you talk about that. Or you might also talk about your spirituality, not meaning religion, but like you might be asking questions like, what's my meaning? What's my purpose? What's the meaning of life? Like that, all those questions have to do with self-actualization. So again, we're not going to be thinking about the meaning of life and our purpose if we come all the way down and our basic needs, our physiological needs are not met, right? So see how all those things build upon each other and our communication is based off of those things. So I'm going to click back real quick. Does anybody have a question? Want to say anything? Raise your hand. Anything? All right. So go ahead if you need that. I'm going to go back to the slides. All right. So now we look at to fulfill. So physical needs, instrumental task needs, relational needs, identity. So all of these things fit into this triangle. So physical needs, obviously, like it says, the basic, but also the safety. Physical needs, if you look at the book, it talks about how this has to do with communication enhancing our physical and our mental health. So it's not just, communication isn't just to get something done, which a lot of times I think that's what we think it is, like just to get something done or to tell somebody about something, to tell a story. It actually is something that helps us psychologically and helps our body. So if you think about like somebody in prison, okay, somebody in prison, one of the worst things that you can do to an inmate, other than obviously the death penalty, would be to put them in solitary confinement, right? To put them in basically a space where they have no interaction with anyone. They can't talk to anybody. They don't see anybody. All of that really wears on a person's mind. Or if you think about, what is that movie? Castaway. Castaway, whenever what's-his-face is on the island and he's sitting there with Wilson, his little volleyball that he creates into a person. Like he created a person because he felt so alone, right? He became dependent on a volleyball and communicating and thinking he could hear the volleyball talking back to him because he needed communication so bad. And that is why communication is so important to us. We would literally go crazy if we couldn't talk to anybody. Even if we're not a social person, we still communicate with somebody. We still put ourselves out there in some way. Even if it's like, I don't talk to friends, but we put all our feelings out there on Facebook. That happens, right? You have those kind of things. You have to communicate in some way. The more we come into ourselves, the more that we don't communicate and talk about things, the more that we're going to start feeling anxiety, the more we're going to stop wanting to be around people. It kind of is a triggering effect. So communication helps us get out there. It helps us physically. It helps us mentally. I mean, that's why we have support groups, right? Support groups are for people going through the same thing so that they can talk about it and they can understand one another. So that's really important for us. Communication has to do with our physical needs, both mentally and psychologically. All right, then we get to instrumental and task needs. So instrumental task needs, those are whenever you get to basically like you go to work, you get on their email, or you talk to your boss, or you talk to whoever, and you get things done. Like these are your tasks, you get it done, you communicate with people to get stuff done. That obviously is what happens. Even in classroom, instrumental task needs are met through communication. We talk about things. I'm telling you about this class. I tell you how to walk through Blackboard. I tell you how to do all kinds of things with your homework. All that is instrumental and task related communication. I'm helping you get from A to B and get the job done. So that is, I mean, even if you were doing entrepreneurship, if you think about every single job, every single thing you're going to do as far as work related or career related, this is going to have to do with that. So like I said, even if you're going to be an entrepreneur and you're the only person in your business, you still have to communicate with someone, because to be an entrepreneur, you have to be selling something to someone, right? So then you're still communicating with the people who are buying your product. So you have to think about that. There's always going to be a reason for communicating instrumental and task needs. And then we have relational needs. So now we're moving kind of up, right? We're thinking about love, belonging, self-esteem. Relationship building is also so important to us as humans. I mean, when you go through middle school, I mean, I think, or high school or anything, or your whole life, think about all elementary, middle, high school, and now in college, all of that. You're constantly looking for that person, for a person to be friends with, or maybe you're the person that's like, oh, I'm looking for my one, my significant other, like whatever it is, we're always looking for that relationship building. We're always building on old relationships. We're creating relationships. Even us talking, when you ask me questions, that's building on a relationship between us, right? When you say hi to me in the hallway, building a relationship. There's all that relationship building that's going on. Let's see if there's anything that's really other important in that little section. But otherwise, that's really the main thing. Is obviously this one I'm not going to go a whole lot into because it's kind of obvious. Yes, relationship building is obviously done through communication. Oh, I will say, if you've ever heard the word self-disclosing, self-disclose just means to share information about oneself. So the closer you feel to somebody, like I said earlier, the closer you feel, the more you feel like you belong, the more you're going to self-disclose to a person. So if you think about a friend you've become very close with, or a friend that you've kind of become distant from, the more you become close, it's because you are sharing more information, you're talking more, you're putting more time and effort into the communication that you have with one another. And then think about the friends that have kind of fallen away. If you think about that, you've probably just slowly communicated less. And maybe when you talk, it's kind of like, oh, I had no idea you were doing that. What's going on? You might not even know what to ask them about because you don't really know what's going on in their life. Right? That all has to do with communication. Communication is truly what ties us and makes our relationship stronger or lessen, right? So now we have identity needs. So identity is then built, our identity, we'll talk about identity in I think in chapter 3, but identity is completely built through communication, both verbally and non-verbally. So that's important to know too. There's lots of different types of communication, and the ones we'll focus on a lot in this one are verbal and non-verbal. But if you think about it, like what I said already, what do you wear? That kind of puts you in a group, right? What you like to wear, the music you listen to, what you talk about, what movies you watch, all these things become part of this identity that we create. And whenever we talk with people and we share things, what we share also creates our identity. We become very attached to this identity, and we want people to know. We have a picture of what we want people to know. And so a lot of times, without even realizing it, we're constantly communicating and taking in feedback about that identity. And that's either going to affirm it or make us not feel affirmed. One of the two. Someone might embarrass you about yourself, and that kind of makes you look at your identity kind of like feel less than. But someone builds you up and it makes your identity feel better. Like you feel better about your identity. So we're constantly communicating about that identity. And then we have spiritual needs. Spiritual needs have a lot to do with that self-actualization process. So spiritual, like I said earlier, does not necessarily mean religion, but religion is a way to talk about and communicate about your spirituality, right? So there's religion, but then some people might talk about spirituality through more like philosophy. They're more interested in, the thinking process and communicating their thoughts and what is the meaning of life, what's my purpose. All of us at one point or another have probably asked yourself, what is my purpose? What am I supposed to do? Where do I want to go from here? What career do I want? Why do I want that career? What do I want to do? Like all these things, all these thoughts have to do kind of with this higher thinking process. But a lot of the questions that we want to know at this random points in our life is like, why are we here? what is my purpose on this earth? And that is kind of what we talk about with spiritual needs. But all of these, like I said, they all build upon one each other. They're all part of this Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But these are the reasons why we communicate. So next we're going to talk about how do we communicate. Does anyone have any questions about that? Let's see. Okay, Stephen said, I had an unfortunate circumstance that caused me to spend most of my middle and higher grades outside school districts. Admittedly, it's made me a little jaded about interacting with groups of people. I mean, I can see that, right? All of our experiences, we'll talk about this, all of our experiences lead to how we feel about communication. So whatever, like if you've had, like you said, you're jaded. If you're jaded about communicating with people around your age group, it's typically because there have been communication situations that have caused that. Right? And that made us not want to interact with those people or interact with people as much. And so that happens. I mean, but then we can also take that and we can say we can start rebuilding that mentality about communicating in others. We have to assume that everyone's not the same and give people a benefit of the doubt. But that's all done through this identity needs and relational needs part of our reasons why we communicate. But that's a good point. If you've been jaded, somebody has hurt you in the past, more likely you're less likely to communicate. Again, this like self-belonging, self-esteem, all that stuff is kind of on that. You're always thinking about, what if these people treat me the same way because of your past experiences? And we'll talk a lot about past experiences. So we are going to, sorry, I thought somebody was coming to my house. I was like, oh no, okay, we're good. All right, so then how do we communicate? So scroll up there. Okay, how do we communicate? So through the use and interpretation of symbols. So this is going to make something that's very simple sound very complicated, but we need to understand it so we can move forward. So symbols, if you think about units of analysis, if you've ever heard that word, units of analysis. So a unit of analysis is basically just the item that someone is studying. So if I was a biology or chemist, I might study molecules. If I was a mathematician, I might study numbers, right? As far as communicator, as far as somebody researching communication, I'm going to study symbols. So symbols, we can see this right here, are the words or images that represent the ideas we're referring to. So what that means is, like, if you think of a word, like the word word is a word that we have constructed, that someone a long time ago who created the English language thought of. We decided word was going to represent words. Or a better way to say this would be like table. Okay, so a long time ago, somebody thought that the word, the letters put together, table, right? That would mean something that, like my computer's sitting on right now, a table, right? So unit of analysis are the symbols for communication. That is what we're focusing on right now as communicators. We'll build onto nonverbal things, but right now we're just focusing on how we even start to communicate. We first have to understand words. Like I have a baby right now. He is learning words. I'm trying to teach him things by saying like mama, like showing my face, dada, Sophie, your giraffe that you love. I have to show him things so he understands. He can put a word with an actual physical item. Right. So that is, when you think about that, the actual physical item is the reference. So we're looking at referent right here, what you want to communicate, right? So the table. So there's a physical table here. I'm telling you table. I put a word with that. If I'm teaching my son that, okay, table. This is what's called a table. Do you see the table? Table. Okay. Now he understands that this is table. So the more we say that, we start learning that. Then when we're not around a table, I can say, hey, we need to go find a table, and he'll think and he'll know what I'm talking about. Now he has put a definition to the symbol that represents a table. Does that make sense? I know that's kind of confusing, so let me say that again. Now when I pull him, say if I put him in a room with no table and said, we need a table, and he thought about it, and he visualized a table, right? He thought about a table, and he might start looking around for where's something I can put my stuff on. Then I know, okay, he understands that when I say the symbol word, or if he reads the word word, or like words, table, that he understands I'm referring to a physical item that we put things on top of, a table, right? So I have for you, real quick, this. So here is what's called the semantic triangle. So when we think about, we have created language as a construct. So language is a system of symbols, right? Our language, the English language, is a system of symbols. We've created this huge language. I mean, all the different languages in the world, they're systems of symbols. So they've created all these words like letters that we've put together and we've made sounds to, so that everyone knows as they're learning a language, this is the word or this is the symbol that represents the thing, right? So the symbol would be table. Then we come over here and we see referent, okay, table. So now we're telling them, for teaching someone the English language, we're saying, hey, table, and maybe we pat a table and say, hey, this is a table. All right. Over time, the more that we make that connection, they'll all of a sudden connect. When I say table to that person, they'll be able to connect and understand the meaning behind the symbol. All right. So that, again, is a really difficult way to understand that. So do we understand how that works, how the semantic triangle works? That is important right here, semantic triangle. So go ahead and write that down, maybe draw that. Maybe for yourself, if you don't have the book yet, go ahead and draw it. Make sure you understand this. But basically, the semantic triangle is how our language as a construct works. How is it constructed? How does it work? How do we start to understand how to communicate? All right. So I'm going to, if you need this and you don't have it finished, I will come back to it. I'm just going to drop it down so we can continue. Okay. All right. So is everyone good? Where did this go? There you go. Is everyone good on that? Is everyone good? All right. I'm going to assume that everyone's good. Okay. All right. So how do we communicate? I'm going to put this back into, there we go. So how do we communicate? Through the use of interpretation symbols, like I just said, going on to models of communication. All right, so now we understand how the basics of how we communicate, right? Just the basic level, how it works. Then we have, now we're like putting that idea of the semantic triangle and understanding language and understanding symbols and all that, we're putting that into motion. So how does that work? So language is not just something that sits there, right? We actually use it. We use language every day. We use communication every day. So we do that through these models. So there's 3 different models that we're going to study. They all kind of build off each other. The first one is the action model. That's the very first one that researchers came up with. Then came the interaction model. Then came the transactional model. So we'll start at the first. But each of these have just built. Like once they realized we need to add some to action model, then we got the interaction. Then they said we need to add more. So then we added to the transactional model. But no matter what, there are these 4 basic elements. We have encoding, decoding, channel, and noise. So no matter what, these are in there. So let's see, pulling this up. So this is the action model. This is the most basic. This is the very first one that researchers have come up with. So go ahead, if you have your notes, if you're taking notes, go ahead and draw this out so you understand it. Okay, so you have the sender, right? So right now, I'm the sender. Technically, if we're talking about looking at this for the action model, I'm the sender because I'm the person lecturing, I'm the person talking to you about communication. So I'm the sender, right? Well, as I'm talking, I have to put together symbols, right? Words, symbols, to create an idea, a thought, a sentence that becomes a message, that I then send to you as my receiver. Right? I do that through the process of encoding. If any of you are computer people, think about it this way. When you encode a message, you encode on computers, or you code on computers, right? You're coding something to make something happen. Same concept. I'm coding, I'm putting together words in order to create a message to send to my receiver. Now, we don't really realize that we're encoding most of the time because we do it so much, especially if in your first language. If English isn't your first language, then you may not do this as readily or as quickly. But if you speak English and that's what you speak, you've always spoke that then you encode very quickly at this point in your life. You come up with things very fast and then you can send a message, right? We don't really think about coming up with words, we just do it. So that would be the message being sent. Okay, so then the receiver gets it and they have to decode it. Your brain, as I'm talking to you, is decoding my message. That means you're breaking it down, you're understanding it, you're learning it, right? That is decoding. Again, this is a process you probably don't even notice unless English isn't your first language. You probably then, if English isn't your first language, you have to think, you have to process a little bit more, right? You have to think about it. So that would be decoding. Now, before this can happen, or while this is happening, I'm the sender, I'm sending you a message. I've encoded, I've sent you a message, you have now received it, and you're decoding it. So that is one thing. But it has to go through what's called a channel. So channel, see this little blue box? This channel is however the message is getting to you as my receiver. So that might be, like right now, it's the computer, right? This computer is the channel. Because I am talking to my computer, you are not physically present. I am talking to the computer. I'm actually talking to a little bubble, or a little camera right there. I'm staring at that this whole time. That is my channel. That is what I'm looking at. So that is how I'm getting you the message. Again, there's the channel, but then we also have what's called noise that comes through the channel and can kind of distract us. So there's two types of noise. There's physical noise, and then there's psychological noise. So a physical noise might be like in this situation, the computer cutting out, my Wi-Fi going out, right? That might be, or just like that a second ago, like I had a person that was driving into my driveway and it broke my thought process, right? I had to look at that. That would be noise, and then trying to come back and remember what I was talking about. Might also be noise if you have people at your house and you say you have a roommate and they're being really loud in the other room. That would be physical noise. Okay, so we have that idea. Now there's the idea of psychological noise. So maybe you're really distracted. Say that like you're thinking about, you have a lot on your mind right now. Maybe you and your significant other just broke up or something, and you're like thinking about that and trying to process that. Or maybe you are just not feeling your best and you're having to do that. There's the idea of like what things going on in your head that are blocking you from being able to hear or understand the message. It might also be, trying to think, I think the book gives some examples of that. So yeah, so just preoccupation with thoughts. So like daydreaming, that's the most basic form of psychological noise, right? So I can't really hear you. Have you ever been listening to someone and then you just kind of, you might even be doing it now with me, you kind of, your brain, you don't even know when it happens, but you just kind of start thinking about something else and then you're like, what? All right. That would be psychological noise, having too much going on in your head that you can't hear the person that's trying to send you a message. Okay, so this is the action model. Now, the one thing we need to understand about the action model that makes it different from the other models is that it's a linear process. It's set up as linear. And if we don't know what linear means, that means a straight line. Meaning that really it's like the sender encodes and sends a message to the receiver who decodes, and then like that process ends. And then the receiver might do it and then send it, and right, and that, so it's making it just like a one straight line, but researchers realize like that's not the way communication works. It's a back and forth thing. So then we came up with, so I'm going to exit out of this. Hopefully you have it. If you don't have it or you don't have, I can send it to you later. I can post it later, but there's that. So I'm going to talk about interaction models. So then researchers added a couple more things. They added, if you notice, feedback. Keep pointing at it. You can't see that. Feedback. They added that so that way it looks more like a circle, right? Like I send a message and then you send me feedback. I send you a message and you send me feedback. Kind of like when I ask you, does anyone have any questions? You might send me a message or you might raise your hand, whichever way, totally fine. But it becomes this circle, right? So basically everything's the same except the feedback is added. And then if you notice over here, context is added. So context is basically the situation. What is going on? Where am I at? So us being online here versus us being in class, those are different contexts. How we act is very different. Me speaking and teaching to you in front of the class is going to be different than if I see you in the hallway or if I talk to you on the phone. I'm not going to be talking, and this is kind of like my presenter voice, right? My presenting voice. This is what how I talk, but I wouldn't say, if I saw you in the hallway and you said, hey, Miss Peters, I want to be like, well, hello, students. I wouldn't say it the same way. I would think about the context, and that would change by communication. Also, you think about if you're talking to me as your professor or instructor, or if you're talking with a friend, if you're in a friend group versus with your boss, however you think about that, all those contexts are going to be different. You're going to treat the situation differently, and you're going to communicate differently. All right, so that is basically how they added that. So the first one, action model, linear, just one-way street. And then they said that's not how it works. It needs to be more like an interaction. We're going back and forth, right? Well, hopefully you have that added. Again, I can post that later if you need it. So then they said, no, actually, this is a transaction. It's constantly happening. It's simultaneous in nature. It's not going to be just like I send you something and then you send it back and then you send it and then you send it back. That's not how it works. Actually, it's constant. We're constantly going back and forth. So this right here might be a little different because I'm on a computer. I have to stop what I'm communicating about to look and see if you've said anything or if you've raised your hand. You know what I mean? So there's that. But when we're talking about, if I'm teaching in front of the class and I'm talking about the same thing, you're giving me body language. Even if you're not verbally saying anything to me, you are actually doing things with your body. The way you look, like your face, your body language. Are you sitting up? Are you actively taking notes? Are you leaning back? Are you crossing your arms? Are you looking at your phone? Are you yawning? All of those things are communicating things to me, whether or not you're saying a word. And while I'm communicating, you're constantly doing that. So there's also the aspect of, if you think about with your friends and you're talking, if somebody that you talk with a lot, just think about an interpersonal communication conversation. You're just talking with somebody. Both of you are making facial expressions. Like say somebody starts telling you about something really bad that happened in their life. You're probably not going to just be like this, or at least I hope you wouldn't be. You're probably going to start, I'm so sorry, right, you know, or if someone's talking for a little bit, they're telling you something, you'll probably go, yes, but you're constantly doing that facial expression, like your friend who's telling you something bad that happened, that facial expression, that is communicating something to them. You're showing them, you know, that you care, and it's simultaneous. Like you're constantly doing it. It's not something that you both stop and then get back, stop and then get back, right? So you can see that this transactional model is just adding in the aspect of it being simultaneous in nature. It also adds in the idea of nonverbal cues being part of that process. Okay, so that is how it builds. First one, action model. Linear, just like all sending the information one way, and then it has to stop and then the other person sends it. Okay, that didn't work. So then we have the next one. Let me go ahead and pull it up here. So then we have the interaction model. Again, that adds feedback and context, but we're sending it back. Okay, this little process. And then we have transactional model, which is just like, it's just happening. It's back and forth, constant, not one way and then the other. All right, any questions on models of communication? That sounds similar to code switching. Awesome. Well, I don't even know what that is, you know, but I'm sure that it's probably something to do with computers, and that's awesome that you understand it. I'm glad you can put it that way. If you're into computers or what Darian is talking about, there you go. It's similar to code switching. I'll have to look that up and use it for an example. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to go on unless anybody has any questions. Okay, so now we're looking at communication myths. Everyone is an adept communicator. That is not true. We all know that person that is not a good communicator. And it does, you know, and it's not necessarily like, oh, they just can't communicate. Some people just may not be adept in understanding how to communicate well. They may think they communicate well, but maybe they talk too much. Or maybe they are not very warm, or the way they say something comes off very blunt and rude. You know, those things are not necessarily what make a good communicator. Just because you can communicate doesn't mean you're a good communicator. Good communication takes skill. You have to build it. So I think I told you on the first day of class how they did like there was a survey done over like all the CEOs and the major CEOs in the country, and they said, what are these top skill sets that you want from your employees? And I think it was like 7 out of 10, but I'm not sure. I'll have to look it up and know for sure. But I know like most of the skill sets of the top 10 were communication related, which tells us that it's a skill. And when we think about the word skill, that's something that's practiced. That's not, I mean, some people might be inherently a little better at it, but you have to practice it to hone in that skill, just like an athlete. An athlete might be naturally good at something, at playing the sport, but they need practice to make them really good. So you have that person that's naturally good at it, but they don't ever practice and they're okay. You have the person that's not naturally good, but they practice really hard and they're okay. But think about the person that's naturally good and practices and how awesome they are. That's when you get to the next level. And that is how we become an adept communicator. We have to both start growing in our ability to do it. We also must practice it. So if you don't feel like you're a good communicator, you're not stuck in that boat. You can work on that and you can build those skills. Okay, communication can solve any problem. Not true. So I'm going to go ahead, just for the sake of time, and kind of put a couple of these together. Communication can solve any problem. Any communication is good communication. More communication will ultimately make people agree with you. False, false, and false. Okay, so sometimes you just got to let things go. You got to let it go, or you got to step back and say, you know what, I'm going to give you time, right? I'm going to give you time. That's what, like, if you're in a fight with somebody, you have to do that. You have to think about, I'm going to give you time to cool off. Like my husband and I'm more of I want to talk about our fight right now. Right? I want to work it out right now. He's one of those people that says, I need a moment. I just need a moment to clear my head. And then I can come back and I can discuss with you. And it took me a full year of marriage to get to a point where I realized I need to give him some space. So sometimes communication cannot solve the problem. You got to let it go. Other times you just need to be quiet, right? I know I'm a talker. I always like to hear that. Sometimes you got to be quiet. And then also, communicating more will make people agree with you. Not true. I mean, if you think about the more someone pushes their thoughts on you and keeps going, that doesn't make you say, oh, you know what, you're so right. I agree with you. Instead, you probably say, okay, one, you're either going to go, okay, I agree with you, and just make them be quiet. Or two, you're going to completely shut that person off because you're like, I cannot handle you, right? One of the two things. So that shows you too much communication doesn't help. Communicating more just because you think that'll be better is not good. Knowing when to stop communicating is actually the best thing possible. And then there's only one type of communication. We've already learned that is also not true. There's nonverbal. There is the way we're communicating right now. There's in-person. There's emails. There's all kinds of communication. And we communicate differently on each of those forums. Okay, questions on that? I'm told that I'm often more, this is Stephen, I'm told I'm often more crass and direct than appropriate. Apologies if I come across that way. Hey, it happens. And you know what? We're here to practice, right? We're going to learn. Okay, competent communicators. So this is our last slide. This is what we're focusing on for the entirety of our class. So I want you to become a competent communicator. Yes, you will be giving speeches, but the amount of speeches you're going to give and then what we're going to be learning in class, I mean, those two things are kind of like, I don't know, separate. There's about this much that you're doing with speeches and about this much you're learning about communication in general. So I want you to become a competent communicator. I want you to be self-aware. So self-aware means that you understand the situation you're in. You understand the context. So you understand how to change your communication depending upon the context you're in. That does not mean you become two-faced or you're not yourself. Those are two different things. I'm talking about I understand that I am in a classroom. So maybe I communicate with my instructor differently than I would a friend or a coworker, right? Maybe I communicate with my boss differently than my coworker that I sit with every day. Those kinds of things, we understand. We're self-aware. We also understand when maybe what we're talking about makes someone uncomfortable. We also know maybe when we need to stop talking. So being self-aware requires a lot of work and self-discipline. So I want to teach us how to be self-aware. And we do that through the process of self-monitoring. We look at when I communicate this way, how did it make someone feel? How is that process? There's also this idea of the generalized other. So the generalized other is kind of like coming up with an idea of a person that you're going to be communicating. When you're thinking about your idea, the thing that you want to communicate, you might have this idea of the person that you're telling it to. And how is what I'm saying going to make that person feel? That's important because by having this generalized other, you kind of bounce that off and then you can think, it helps you empathize with that person, helps you see maybe that person might not like it if I say it that way, right? A lot of times if I'm trying to think about how to handle a difficult situation or a conflict with someone, coming up with the generalized other or how this other person that might come up, like that I'm communicating with and I'm trying to think of an idea of how the best way to get my message across, having that generalized other helps me realize, okay, that might have sounded rude. that might have sounded like I don't care, right? So that generalized other is just basically a made up person that you are having almost like a pretend conversation with. You naturally probably do this sometimes in your head when you're thinking out a conversation without realizing it, but that's basically the generalized other. Okay, we are also responsive and adaptable. So the one thing that you probably want to think about is that, again, you adapt to the situation, you adapt to the person, you adapt to what's happening. There's not communication, one size fits all, right? That's not how communication works. You have to be responsive to how that person's acting. Like, it would be inappropriate if my friend is telling me something really bad in her life for me to be like, oh, that's so fun. Not appropriate, right? Responsive and adaptable. Think about the situation. Okay, use person-centered messages. Again, that's the idea of the generalized other. Think about the other person. How's it going to make them feel? It's also the idea of not saying I all the time, but saying we and talking about them. You think about the other people that you're going to be communicating to, and then use language that's going to be centered on what they will understand. And then cognitively complex. So being a good communicator takes cognitive complexity. Cognitive meaning the way you think, cognitive, right? You have to be complex because you have to think about each person as an individual versus everyone as just this general, right? So you have to think, and you have to think harder. And at first it may be kind of difficult, but then the more you practice, the better you get at it. Then finally, ethical and civil. So sometimes it's hard to be civil when someone's not being civil towards you, but you have to think about, in my communication, everything that I'm trying to say needs to be ethical. It needs to be kind, needs to be polite, needs to be thoughtful. However, that doesn't mean that you have to be a doormat. That doesn't mean like I'm just going to be this person. It means that I'm going to communicate my thoughts, but in a way that's not going to offend others. And that's going to take cognitive complexity, right? You can't just come up with something like that. You have to think about it. All right, so that is all for our first chapter.